Another morning arrives just like the one before. Morning did not arrive with urgency. It never did. It arrived the way it almost always had in America, quietly, patiently, without asking for attention. The sky lightened by degrees so small that no one could say exactly when night had ended and day had begun. The darkness simply thinned, like fog lifting from a field that had seen it many times before. Somewhere an alarm clock rang, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to remind someone that another morning had arrived, just like the one before it. In a small house on a residential street, the alarm was pressed off. A hand reached out from beneath a blanket that had been warmed through the night. The room remained still. The person inside the bed did not move right away. There was no need to rush. There rarely was. Outside, the street waited. It had been waiting all night. The houses stood in their usual places, lined up with familiar patience. Their windows reflected the pale blue of early morning. Curtains stayed closed. Porches were empty. Lawns were quiet. Nothing unusual was happening, and that was the point. A clock ticked somewhere inside the house. It had been ticking for years. It would keep ticking whether anyone listened or not. The sound was steady and predictable, marking time in a way that did not require thought. In the kitchen, a coffee maker was switched on. It hummed softly, performing a task it had done almost every morning for a very long time. Water heated. Coffee grounds waited. Soon the smell would spread through the room, gentle and familiar. This was not a special morning. It was not a historic one. No one would write about it later. But it was a morning that belonged to America all the same. In another house, a few streets away, someone opened their eyes slowly. Light filtered through the blinds in thin lines. Dust floated in the air, visible only because the light made it so. The room felt cool. The floor would feel colder when feet finally touched it. There was no reason to hurry. Work would begin at the same time it always did. The bus would arrive when it usually arrived. The road would look the same as it did yesterday. Morning, after all, had a routine. America trusted routines. In kitchens across the country, similar motions unfolded. Cups were placed on counters. Bread was lowered into toasters. Newspapers were lifted from doorsteps, folded once, and set aside for later. The headlines were there, but they could wait. Outside, a car started. Its engine turned over without complaint. The sound echoed briefly in the quiet street and then faded as the car moved away. Another car followed, then another. The neighborhood was waking, but it was doing so gently. A woman stood at her sink, looking out the window without really seeing anything in particular. The street looked as it always had. The tree across the way had lost a few more leaves since last week. The sidewalk showed a faint crack that had been there for years. She sipped her coffee. It tasted like coffee always did. Somewhere else, a man sat at the edge of his bed, tying his shoes slowly. He did not think about history. He thought about whether it might rain later. He thought about the meeting he would attend that morning, which would likely be similar to the one last week. Time moved forward without making an announcement. The radio came on in a living room. A calm voice began reading the morning news. The tone was steady. The words were familiar. Events happened far away, described in measured sentences. The listener nodded once, then focused back on the act of buttering toast. The news had its place, but so did breakfast. On sidewalks, footsteps began to appear. Not many, just enough to suggest that the day was beginning. A man walked his dog at the same pace he always did. The dog stopped at the same spots, sniffing the ground as if checking to see if anything had changed overnight. It had not. At a bus stop, Two people waited without speaking. They stood at a polite distance from one another, staring ahead. They had likely seen each other before. They might see each other again tomorrow. There was comfort in that kind of quiet familiarity. The bus arrived on time. The doors opened with a soft hiss. People stepped inside, scanned their passes, and took seats they preferred. The bus pulled away, joining the slow flow of morning traffic. Above it all, the sky continued to brighten. Clouds moved at an unhurried pace. The sun rose as it always had, indifferent to whether anyone noticed. In schools, lights flicked on in empty classrooms. Desks waited, chalk wested on ledges. The floors had been cleaned the night before and still carried the faint smell of wax. Soon the quiet would be replaced by voices, but for now the building rested. In offices, elevators carried early arrivals upward. Shoes echoed briefly in hallways. Coats were hung. Briefcases were placed beside desks. Computers were turned on, screens glowing softly in the dim light. Work would happen, not urgently, just steadily. Morning in America had learned how to be patient. In a diner on a corner lot, the door unlocked at the same time it did every day. The lights came on, coffee pots were filled, stools waited at the counter. The cook moved through familiar motions, barely thinking about them. Soon, regulars would arrive. They would order the same meals, they would sit in the same seats. The waitress would greet them by name or with a nod. None of this would feel new. That was what made it comforting. In a small apartment, a child sat at the table eating cereal. The spoon moved from bowl to mouth slowly. The child listened to the sounds of the building waking up, the distant footsteps in the hallway, the closing of a door, the faint hum of traffic outside. Morning had its own language, spoken in small sounds. A clock on the wall marked the time. It did not hurry, it simply continued. Across the country, millions of similar moments unfolded. None of them were coordinated. None of them needed to be. They were connected only by their ordinariness. America did not wake up all at once. It woke in pieces. In rural areas, the morning felt wider. Fields stretched under the lightening sky. Barns stood quietly. A farmer stepped outside, breathing in the cool air, listening to the distant sound of machinery warming up. The land had seen many mornings. It did not react to this one. In cities, the soundscape grew denser slowly. Traffic increased. Trains moved underground. Coffee shops opened their doors. People flowed through intersections, guided by lights that changed color with mechanical consistency. No one stopped to think about how many mornings had come before. There was no need to. Morning was not a question. It was a habit. In bedrooms, beds were made or left unmade. Curtains were opened a little more. Windows were cracked to let in air. Shoes were placed near doors. Keys were checked, then checked again. Small preparations for a day that promised very little difference from the last. Some people felt tired. Some people felt alert. Most felt somewhere in between. Morning did not demand emotion. It allowed whatever arrived naturally. A man poured the last of the coffee into his cup and glanced at the clock. He had time. He always did, as long as nothing unexpected happened. Nothing usually did. On a porch, a newspaper lay folded, untouched. The print would still be there later. History could wait. Morning was for beginnings that did not feel like beginnings at all. In factories, machines were turned on one by one. The sound filled the space gradually, becoming a steady background noise. Workers took their places. Gloves were adjusted. Switches were flipped. Production resumed without ceremony. In a post office, bins waited to be filled. Mail sorted itself into routes that had existed for decades. Addresses were familiar. The system worked because it did not change. Morning respected systems.
In a hospital, lights glowed softly in hallways. Night shifts handed responsibilities to day shifts. Charts were reviewed. Quiet conversations took place at desks. Life continued in careful increments. Outside again, the streets were no longer empty, but they were not crowded either. They had reached their usual state, balanced between stillness and movement. A breeze passed through, stirring leaves along the curb. They moved briefly, then settled again. Morning did not linger. It did not rush. It simply unfolded. People stepped into their roles without thinking of them as roles. They were just doing what came next. The nation, if it could be said to wake at all, did so without stretching. It did not yawn. It did not announce itself. It simply continued. Somewhere, a clock struck the hour.
The gentle business of going to work. Work did not begin with excitement. It rarely did. In America, work usually began quietly, almost politely, as if it did not wish to disturb anyone. It followed morning the way it always had, stepping in without ceremony, without drama, and without much expectation beyond repetition. People left their homes at familiar times. Doors opened, doors closed. Keys turned in locks with practiced hands. The sound of footsteps on porches and sidewalks blended into the background of the day. No one announced that they were going to work. They simply went. Cars moved slowly down residential streets, stopping at the same corners, waiting at the same signs. Engines hummed at steady volumes. Radios played softly, not to entertain so much as to fill the silence with something predictable. The roads accepted the traffic without complaint. They had been doing so for years. On highways, lanes filled gradually, not all at once, but steadily, like water rising in a river after rain. Drivers maintained familiar distances from one another. They knew where the curves were. They knew which exits were theirs. Some drivers thought about the day ahead. Others did not think much at all. The commute itself did not require thought. It had been learned through repetition. In cities, buses followed routes that had not changed in a long time. Stops came and went. Doors opened and closed. Passengers boarded with the same calm movements every morning. A man found his usual seat and sat down without looking around. A woman stood near the door, holding the same rail she always held. Their faces showed no urgency. The bus would get them where they needed to go. It always did. Train platforms filled slowly. People waited in lines that formed without instruction. Trains arrived with familiar sounds. Doors slid open. The exchange happened again. Work approached, but it did not rush. In factories, the day began with clocks and whistles, not loud ones, just enough to mark the start. Workers entered through wide doors, greeting one another with nods or short words that did not require replies. The building smelled like oil and metal and something else that could not quite be named. It always smelled that way. Machines waited where they had been left. Switches were flipped. Lights came on in sections. The factory woke up piece by piece, not all at once. Hands moved with practiced ease. Tools were picked up. Gloves were pulled on. The work itself did not demand explanation. Everyone knew what came next. This was not heroic labor. It was steady labor. It did not seek recognition. It sought completion. In offices, elevators carried people upward in quiet groups. No one spoke unless they already knew one another well. Floors were announced in soft electronic voices. The doors opened. People stepped out. Hallways stretched ahead unchanged. Offices waited with desks and chairs and papers that had been left in neat stacks the day before. Lights were turned on. Computers were started. Screens glowed patiently. A woman placed her bag beneath her desk and straightened a stack of files. She did this every morning. It brought a sense of order that she appreciated, even if she did not think about it consciously. Work in offices often began with small acts. A calendar was checked, an email was opened, a cup of coffee was set down carefully to avoid spills. The day moved forward one task at a time. In small businesses, doors were unlocked at consistent hours, signs were flipped from closed to open, lights came on in rooms that had been dark overnight. A clerk arranged items on shelves, aligning them carefully. A shop owner counted cash in a register, writing numbers on a pad, even though they already knew the totals by heart. Customers would come. They usually did. In schools, teachers arrived early. They placed books on desks. They wrote dates on chalkboards. The rooms felt empty but prepared. Children would arrive soon, bringing noise and motion. But for now, the quiet belonged to the adults who made the building ready. Work often meant preparation before anything visible happened. On farms, the workday had already begun by the time the sun was fully up. Animals needed tending, equipment needed checking, fields needed attention. The rhythm was older here, less tied to clocks, and more tied to light. Still, it was no less predictable. Tasks repeated themselves with comforting regularity. Across the country, people entered workplaces that looked the same as they had the day before. Nothing new was expected of the buildings. They stood ready, doing their part by remaining unchanged. Labor in America often took comfort in sameness. A man sat at a desk and opened a ledger. He ran his finger down a column of numbers. He had done this yesterday. He would do it again tomorrow. The numbers mattered, but they did not excite him. That was fine. A woman stood behind a counter and greeted her first customer of the day. The greeting was warm but brief. The transaction was simple. Money changed hands, a receipt printed. Another task completed. In warehouses, forklifts moved slowly between rows of shelves. Pallets were lifted. Boxes were placed. Inventory shifted in small ways that few people would ever notice. The system worked because it did not call attention to itself. In hospitals, work never fully stopped, but it did change pace. Morning rounds began. Charts were reviewed again. Quiet conversations took place in hallways. The work here mattered deeply, but it was still approached with routine. That routine made it possible. In construction sites, workers gathered and then spread out. Tools were unloaded. Plans were reviewed briefly, often without much discussion. They knew what needed to be done. In offices again, meetings began. People sat around tables or joined calls. Notes were taken. Decisions were made quietly, sometimes tentatively. Not every decision would matter. Most would simply allow work to continue. Lunch times were noted on clocks, but they did not hurry the work. They waited for their turn. Work moved at its own speed. In retail stores, music played softly over speakers. Employees folded clothes or arranged displays. They checked the time occasionally, not because they were impatient, but because it was part of the rhythm. Morning work flowed into midday work without clear boundaries. In mailrooms, letters were sorted into bins. Packages were stacked on carts. Routes were planned using maps that had been used for years. The mail would go out. It always did. In factories, the machines settled into steady sounds. Workers adjusted to them, their movements syncing with the rhythm. There was comfort in knowing what came next. In offices, keyboards clicked softly. Phones rang and were answered. Conversations stayed brief and focused. No one made speeches. No one stopped to mark the moment. Work was not about moments. It was about continuity. Across America, millions of people performed tasks that would never be recorded in history books. They did not expect to be. Their labor supported systems that allowed mornings to unfold smoothly.
that allowed evenings to come without disruption. The predictability of work was not boring to those who depended on it. It was reassuring. A man checked his watch. It was still early. That was fine. A woman finished a task and moved on to the next without pause. Work did not need encouragement. It moved forward on habit alone. Outside workplaces, the day continued. Traffic flowed, clouds moved, the sun climbed higher. Inside, people focused on small details. Work was a collection of small actions repeated many times. By late morning, routines had fully taken over. The day no longer felt like a beginning, it felt like continuation. People settled into their roles and forgot about the time. This forgetting was part of the design. Work days passed not because of excitement, but because of structure. In America, work often asked for patience more than passion, and patience, practiced daily, became something like comfort. As hours passed, tasks accumulated and were completed. Not all of them, never all of them, just enough. Work did not promise satisfaction, it promised stability. That promise was usually kept. When people thought about work at all, they thought about it in practical terms: what needed to be done, what could wait. Few thought about work as history. But later, looking back, it would be clear that this gentle business of going to work, these commutes, these shifts, these routines, had shaped the country more quietly than any single event. For now, though, no one needed to think about that. They only needed to keep going.
The sound of industry in the background. Industry did not announce itself. It was already there when people arrived, already humming softly in the background, already doing what it had been doing for years. The sound was not loud enough to demand attention, not quiet enough to disappear. It lived somewhere in between, steady and reliable, like breathing. Factories across America did not wake suddenly. They eased into the day. Lights came on in sections. Machines were tested briefly, then allowed to run. The air filled with familiar noises, metal moving against metal, belts turning, motors settling into their rhythms. No one stopped to listen closely. They did not need to. The sound of industry was not something to be examined. It was something to exist alongside. Workers entered through wide doors, carrying lunch pails that had been packed the night before. The pails were dented from use. Their handles fit comfortably into hands that had held them many times. Inside were sandwiches wrapped in paper, apples, sometimes leftovers. Nothing fancy, nothing new. The factory floor looked the same as it had yesterday. The same machines stood in the same places. The same marks lined the floor where carts rolled back and forth. The same clocks hung on the walls, counting time in small, even movements. Shift changes happened without ceremony. One group finished, another began. They nodded to one another as they passed, exchanging places without words. The work continued as if nothing had happened. This continuity was the goal. In warehouses, the sound was different, but no less steady. Forklifts beeped softly as they moved. Boxes were stacked. Pallets were shifted from one place to another. The air smelled like cardboard and dust and oil. Inventory did not care who moved it. It only needed to be moved. Railroads ran through towns and cities, connecting places without stopping to explain themselves. Trains passed at scheduled times. Their horns sounded briefly, more as warning than announcement. People heard the trains and kept doing what they were doing. Tracks stretched across the land, following routes decided long ago. The rails did not change direction. They followed the plan. They always had. In small towns, the sound of industry blended into daily life. A mill ran on the edge of town. A processing plant hummed quietly near the highway. Trucks came and went at predictable hours. People learned to live with these sounds. Eventually, they stopped noticing them. Inside factories, work happened at a pace set by machines. Workers adjusted their movements to match. Hands learned where to go. Bodies learned how long tasks took. There was no rush. There was no performance. There was only completion. A man stood at his station, watching a machine perform the same action over and over. He checked it occasionally, adjusted it when necessary. Most of the time, it did not need adjusting. The machine was good at what it did. Nearby, another worker performed a task that required more movement. She lifted, turned, placed, and repeated. Her body knew the sequence. Her mind wandered freely. Industry allowed for wandering thoughts. Lunch breaks came at scheduled times. Whistles blew or lights flashed, signaling a pause. Workers washed their hands, sat down, opened lunch pails. They ate slowly. They talked about ordinary things or did not talk at all. Some stared at walls. Some looked at clocks. No one rushed the break. The machines waited. When lunch ended, the work resumed as if it had never stopped. In rail yards, workers moved between cars, checking connections, adjusting switches. The sound of metal echoed softly. The ground vibrated slightly as engines idled. Trains did not hurry. They followed schedules that had been refined over years. In warehouses, clipboards were checked, numbers were written down, systems updated themselves through routine. Industry depended on these small confirmations. In factories, supervisors walked slowly through aisles, observing without interfering. They looked for problems that rarely appeared. Most days there were none. The system worked because it had been allowed to settle. Outside, trucks backed into loading docks, engines idled, doors opened, goods moved from one space to another. No one asked where everything was going. It was enough to know that it was going. The sound of industry carried through walls and across streets. It became part of the environment, like wind or distant traffic. In cities, office workers heard it faintly through windows. In rural areas, farmers heard it from miles away. Everyone recognized it, even if they did not think about it. It was the sound of things continuing. Shift changes came again later in the day. Afternoon replaced morning. Evening replaced afternoon. The pattern repeated. A worker removed gloves and placed them in a locker. Another worker put on gloves that were already worn in. The gloves did not mind. Factories did not care who worked inside them. They only required that someone did. In some places, industry was quieter, in others louder, but everywhere it shared the same quality of persistence. Railroads continued through rain and snow. Warehouses operated under artificial light when daylight faded. Factories adjusted to seasons without complaint. Industry did not notice the weather. It noticed schedules. In break rooms, coffee was poured into chipped mugs. The coffee tasted the same every day. That was part of its appeal. Workers leaned back in chairs and rested briefly. They checked watches. Time moved forward. The sound of industry did not change much from decade to decade. Machines were updated, systems improved, but the underlying rhythm remained. This rhythm did not inspire speeches. It did not inspire songs. It inspired trust. People trusted that the work would be there tomorrow. In shipping centers, packages moved along conveyor belts. Labels were scanned. Destinations were assigned. The process was quiet, efficient, and unremarkable. No one celebrated a package reaching the correct bin. That was expected. In factories, again, warning lights blinked occasionally. Adjustments were made. The system corrected itself. Industry preferred self-correction to disruption. Workers learned to read the sounds. A slight change in pitch meant attention was needed. A pause meant something had stopped.
Most of the time, nothing stopped. In towns built around industry, the sounds shaped daily life. Children grew up hearing them. Adults measured time by them. When the sound paused for maintenance or holidays, it felt strange. The quiet seemed too large, but the sound always returned. In rail depots, workers waited for trains that arrived when expected. Delays were rare. When they happened, they were managed calmly. The work continued. Industry did not create heroes. It created habits. No one expected applause for loading a truck or tightening a bolt. The satisfaction came from knowing it was done, and then done again. In warehouses, lights turned off in sections as shifts ended. The building rested briefly before the next group arrived. The sound faded slightly, then returned. Factories ran at night. Railroads ran at night. Warehouses ran at night. Industry did not sleep. People slept while it worked. This continuity allowed mornings to arrive without disruption. Stores were stocked. Trains were ready. Power flowed. Goods moved. The sound of industry made quiet life possible. Workers rarely spoke about their work in dramatic terms. They described it plainly. It was fine. It paid the bills. It filled the day. That was enough. As years passed, the sound of industry remained constant even as people changed. Workers retired. New workers arrived. The machines noticed in small ways. Industry remembered through wear patterns and maintenance logs. In some places, factories closed. The sound faded. People noticed then. But while it was there, it felt permanent. Warehouses continued to sort. Railroads continued to connect. Factories continued to produce. Lunch pails were filled again. Shifts changed again. Machines ran again. The sound stayed in the background, where it belonged. It did not demand gratitude. It did not seek recognition. It simply continued, steady and familiar, supporting a nation that often slept through its labor, trusting that when morning came, everything would still be there. And most of the time, it was.
Homes that stayed standing while time passed. Homes did not try to be important. They stood where they had been built and did what was asked of them. They held walls upright. They kept roofs over rooms. They allowed people to sleep, to sit, to return each evening without needing to think very much about where they were going. Across America, houses stayed standing while time passed around them. Some were small, some were larger. Some were new, and some had already been there for decades. But all of them shared the same quiet purpose, to remain. In the early morning, houses were still. They held the warmth left behind by sleeping bodies. Floors waited for footsteps. Chairs waited to be pulled out. Tables waited to have something placed upon them. The houses did not hurry anyone. In neighborhoods, houses stood side by side with polite distance between them. Lawns stretched out in front. Fences marked boundaries that rarely needed explanation. Trees grew slowly nearby, their shadows shifting slightly each day. Porches faced the street, patient and open. Some were wide enough for chairs, some were narrow and plain. All of them served as small transitions between inside and outside. A man stepped onto his porch and paused, not because he needed to, but because he often did. He looked down the street. It looked the same as it had yesterday. That was reassuring. Inside houses, furniture stayed where it had been placed. Couches held the shape of the people who used them most. Chairs creaked softly when someone sat down. Tables bore small marks from years of meals and use. The furniture did not mind the marks. They were evidence of time being spent. In living rooms, lamps stood quietly until evening. Books rested on shelves, some opened often, some never touched. Clocks hung on walls, keeping time in the same way they always had.
The sound of a ticking clock blended easily into domestic life. In kitchens, cabinets opened and closed. Dishes were washed and returned to their places. Appliances hummed when needed and stayed silent when not. The kitchen was not dramatic, it was functional. Breakfast happened there. Dinner happened there. Many conversations happened there without anyone remembering them later. Houses absorbed these moments without comment. In bedrooms, beds were made or left undone, sheets were washed and replaced, pillows softened over time. People slept there night after night, trusting the walls to remain upright and the ceiling to stay in place. This trust was rarely acknowledged. It did not need to be. In rented rooms, the sense of permanence was different but still present. The furniture might not belong to the person using it. The walls might be painted a color chosen by someone else long ago. But the room still offered shelter. It still held belongings. It still provided a place to return to. Renters learned to live lightly in spaces they did not own, but the houses themselves did not distinguish. They sheltered whoever arrived. In apartment buildings, the sound of domestic life traveled between units. Footsteps above, water running nearby, doors closing down the hall. Each apartment held its own routines, but the building held them together. In older houses, repairs were ongoing. A loose step was fixed. A leaking faucet was tightened. Paint peeled and was repainted. Maintenance was part of domestic life. A woman noticed a crack in the wall that had been there for years. It had grown slightly, or perhaps she was only noticing it now. She made a mental note to mention it later. The house did not seem concerned. Front porches hosted quiet activities. People sat and watched the street. They waved to neighbors. They rested. Children played nearby, moving in and out of sight. Their voices rose and fell. The houses listened without responding. In the evenings, lights came on inside homes one by one. Windows glowed softly. Curtains were drawn. The neighborhood shifted into a different mode, slower and quieter. Inside, dinners were prepared. Pots were placed on stoves. Plates were set on tables. Meals were eaten without ceremony. Sometimes there was conversation. Sometimes there was only the sound of utensils and chewing. Both were acceptable. After dinner, people moved to living rooms. They sat. They rested. They turned on televisions or radios. The programs were familiar. The volume was moderate. The houses held the sound inside their walls. Furniture supported tired bodies. Feet were placed on coffee tables despite rules made earlier. The furniture did not protest. In bedrooms, closets held clothes arranged in familiar ways. Shoes were lined up near doors. Coats hung where they always hung. Morning would come again, and the house would be ready. In some homes, families lived together for many years. In others, people came and went. Children grew up. Parents aged. Rooms changed purpose. A bedroom became an office. A playroom became storage space. A guest room remained unused most of the time. The house adapted quietly. In rural areas, houses stood farther apart. They faced open land. Wind moved around them freely. Weather left marks more clearly. Still, they remained. Farmhouses held generations under the same roof. Additions were built. Rooms were closed off. Porches were enclosed. The structure evolved slowly, never all at once. In cities, row houses stood shoulder to shoulder. Their walls touched. Their histories overlapped. Inside, each one held a separate life. People learned to accept the sounds of others living nearby. The houses made space for this acceptance. Repairs happened when they had to. Roofs were patched. Windows were replaced. Floors were sanded and refinished. These tasks were not exciting, but they were necessary. A man stood on a ladder fixing a light fixture. He worked carefully. He did not think about the house's history.
He only wanted the light to work again. The house waited patiently. In basements, boxes were stored, old furniture rested, seasonal decorations waited their turn. Basements held the evidence of past decisions. In attics, dust gathered, forgotten items sat untouched. The space was rarely visited. The house remembered, even when people did not. In bathrooms, routines repeated daily. Water ran. Mirrors reflected faces that changed slowly over time. The house did not judge these changes. At night, houses settled. They made small sounds as temperatures changed. Pipes clicked. Wood adjusted. These sounds were familiar enough to be ignored. People slept through them. Across decades, houses watched families move through stages of life. They observed without emotion. They saw arguments and reconciliations. They saw celebrations and quiet grief. They saw long periods where nothing much happened at all. Most of the time, nothing much happened. That was what made houses reliable. In neighborhoods, houses were sold. New owners arrived. Paint colors changed. Furniture was moved in and out. The house accepted each change. In rented spaces, leases ended. New tenants arrived with boxes and plans. The walls did not remember names for long. Still, they provided the same shelter. Front porches aged slowly. Paint chipped. Boards loosened. Repairs were made when necessary. People continued to sit there regardless. In the winter, houses held heat inside. In summer, they tried to keep it out. Windows were opened and closed. Curtains adjusted. The house worked with the seasons, not against them. In some homes, traditions formed. A chair that belonged to one person. A room used only on holidays. A table where everyone gathered. These traditions were not written down. They were practiced. The house supported them quietly. Time passed in houses without being announced. Years moved through rooms the way light moved across floors, slowly and without resistance. People marked time with calendars and birthdays, but the house marked time with wear. A door handle smoothed by use, a step worn slightly lower in the center, a floorboard that always creaked. These were the house's records. In moments of change, moving out, moving in, people noticed the house more. They looked at rooms differently. They remembered moments that had taken place there. Then they left. The house remained. New people arrived. New routines formed. The house adjusted again. This continuity was not dramatic. It was not celebrated. It was simply there. At night, houses stood quietly in rows and clusters and alone on hillsides. Lights went out one by one. Streets grew still. Inside, people slept. The houses stayed awake only enough to hold them. They would be there in the morning. They always were.
Lunch hours and the middle of the day. The middle of the day arrived without ceremony. It did not announce itself the way morning sometimes did, and it did not promise rest the way evening eventually would. It simply appeared, quietly, slipping in between tasks, between hours, between moments that were already familiar. In America, lunchtime was not dramatic. It was practical. Clocks moved toward noon. Shadows shifted slightly. Hunger arrived not suddenly, but gradually, like a small reminder that the body had been working for a while. In offices, people noticed the time without commenting on it. Someone looked at a watch. Someone else glanced at the clock on the wall. The work slowed just a little, enough to allow the thought of food to take shape. Lunch would happen. It always did. In cafeterias, trays were stacked neatly at the entrance. The air carried the mixed smell of cooked food and cleaning solution. Lights reflected off long tables and simple chairs. The menu did not surprise anyone. It did not need to. People lined up patiently,
trays sliding forward inch by inch. Plates were filled with familiar items. Portions were reasonable. Choices were limited. This limitation was comforting. Conversations in line were quiet and brief. Someone mentioned the weather. Someone else nodded. There was no urgency in the talk. There was time. When people sat down, they chose seats without thinking too much about it. Some sat alone. Some sat with the same coworkers they always sat with. The table held trays, cups, napkins, and nothing else of importance. Eating began slowly. Forks moved steadily. Chewing filled the silence between short exchanges of words. The conversations did not aim anywhere. They drifted. Someone mentioned a television show from the night before. Someone else spoke about a minor inconvenience at work. These topics did not require conclusions. In factories, lunch breaks were marked clearly. A whistle blew or a light changed. Machines slowed and then stopped. Workers washed their hands and moved to break areas. They opened lunch pails that had been prepared earlier, often the night before. Inside were sandwiches wrapped carefully. Some were plain. Some had small additions: lettuce, tomato, a slice of cheese. Fruit rested beside them, sometimes a cookie. The food was familiar enough to feel reassuring. Workers sat on benches or at tables. They leaned back slightly, letting the body rest. They ate without hurry. Some talked. Some stayed quiet. Both were acceptable. The factory waited patiently for the break to end. In schools, cafeterias filled with students carrying trays. The noise level was higher, but even here, lunchtime followed a pattern. Students sat in groups that had formed naturally. They ate food they had eaten many times before. They talked about classes, about friends, about things that mattered to them at that moment. Adults watched the clock. In diners, lunchtime had a rhythm all its own. Regular customers arrived at predictable times. They sat at counters or in booths that felt familiar. Menus were opened and closed quickly. Orders were placed without much discussion. Coffee cups were filled and refilled. The diner hummed quietly with conversation and the sound of utensils. The cook worked steadily, producing meals that looked the same as they always had. Plates were placed on the counter. Food was served. No one clapped. No one expected to. In offices again, some people ate at their desks. They unwrapped lunches brought from home. Containers were opened. Lids were set aside. The smell of food mixed with the smell of paper and electronics. Emails waited while lunch was eaten. Work paused, but not completely. In parks and outdoor spaces, people sat on benches with bags at their feet. They watched others pass by. They ate slowly, enjoying the brief change of scenery. The day felt suspended here, just for a moment. Conversations drifted in and out of hearing range. Laughter appeared briefly, then faded. Silence returned. In warehouses, lunch breaks followed strict schedules. Groups rotated through break rooms. The room filled, then emptied, then filled again. Microwaves hummed. Refrigerators opened and closed. Chairs scraped lightly against floors. People checked their phones or stared at walls. Both were acceptable ways to rest. The middle of the day did not ask much of anyone. In small towns, lunch hours felt slower. Restaurants filled briefly, then emptied. Streets grew quiet again. Shops closed for short periods. Signs were placed in windows. Doors were locked temporarily. This pause felt natural. In cities, lunchtime crowds moved through streets and buildings. Lines formed at food counters. Sidewalks filled. Even here, the energy was contained. People knew where they were going. Lunch did not interrupt the day. It fit into it. In construction sites, workers sat on overturned buckets or steps. They ate quickly or slowly, depending on preference. Hard hats rested nearby.
The work would resume soon enough. In hospitals, lunch breaks were staggered. Someone was always working. Food was eaten in small portions of time. The day continued without pause. Across America, millions of people ate lunch at roughly the same time, without coordination, without awareness of one another. This shared experience did not feel shared. It felt individual. In offices, lunch hours passed quietly. Desks remained occupied or temporarily empty. The building breathed differently during this time. The noise level changed. Phones rang less often. Typing slowed. The middle of the day settled in. People returned to work gradually. Lunch containers were closed. Trays were returned. Trash was thrown away. Hands were washed. Faces were wiped. Chairs were adjusted. The transition back to work was gentle. The middle of the day did not demand attention. It did not leave a strong impression. That was its strength. Moments where nothing important happened filled the lunch hour. These moments were not empty. They were restful. People did not make decisions that changed their lives during lunch. They did not plan revolutions. They did not rewrite history. They ate. They rested. They waited. In diners, checks were paid. Tips were left. Customers stood and stretched slightly before leaving. The counter was wiped clean. In cafeterias, tables were cleared. Trays were stacked. Floors were swept. The space prepared itself for the next day. Outside, the sun continued its path. The light shifted slightly. Afternoon approached without urgency. People felt neither fully energized nor fully tired. They existed in between. The middle of the day held this feeling gently. In offices, meetings resumed. Emails were answered. Files were opened again. In factories, machines started back up. The sound returned. In warehouses, carts rolled again. The lunch hour faded into memory almost immediately. Later, few people would remember what they had eaten. Fewer would remember who they had sat with. That was fine. Lunch was not meant to be remembered. It was meant to happen. And in happening, it allowed the day to continue, unbroken, steady, and calm. The middle of the day passed the way it always did, quietly, completely, and without leaving much behind.
News read softly and soon forgotten. The news arrived quietly. It did not knock on the door or raise its voice. It simply appeared, the way it always had, settling gently into the background of the day. In America, the news rarely demanded attention. It waited patiently to be noticed, and just as patiently accepted being ignored. In the morning, radios were turned on while coffee brewed. The volume was kept low. The voice that emerged was calm, steady, and practiced. It spoke clearly, without hurry, as if there was no need to rush through the world's events. The announcer read the headlines in the same tone used every day. There was no excitement in the delivery, no urgency. Words moved forward at an even pace. Listeners nodded occasionally or did not react at all. In kitchens, people poured cereal into bowls while the radio continued talking. The news filled the space between clinks of spoons and the hum of appliances. It existed alongside breakfast, not above it. Someone heard about an event far away, a city they had never visited, a place they might never see. The information passed through their mind briefly, then made room for thoughts about the day ahead. The toast popped up. In living rooms, newspapers rested on coffee tables or kitchen counters. They were folded neatly, often unopened. When they were opened, they were read slowly, without much focus. Pages rustled softly. Headlines appeared in bold print, then disappeared as pages were turned. Some articles were skimmed, others were skipped entirely.
Advertisements were noticed more than the news itself. The newspaper did not mind. It had been through this before. In offices, radios played quietly in the background. Televisions mounted in break rooms showed morning programs. The sound was low enough that it blended into the hum of the building. People passed by without stopping. They glanced at screens without reading the words. The news continued anyway. In factories, radios were tuned to stations that mixed news with music. The announcer's voice rose and fell between songs. Headlines were delivered between weather reports and traffic updates. Listeners listened without really listening. The sound was familiar. The words were expected. The machines continued to run. At lunch counters and diners, newspapers lay open beside plates. Customers read while eating, pausing occasionally to take a bite. They did not rush through the articles. They did not linger on them either. A story about politics appeared on the page. Someone read the first paragraph and then turned the page. Another story took its place. The coffee was refilled. In the early afternoon, television news programs played in offices and homes where someone was around to turn them on. The anchors sat behind desks, dressed professionally, speaking with practiced calm. Their voices were reassuring in their steadiness. They described events using careful language. They avoided extremes. They presented facts without drama. The screen showed images of places far away. The images were small, contained within the frame. Viewers watched briefly, then returned to what they were doing. In waiting rooms, televisions played news channels continuously. Patients and visitors sat quietly, glancing occasionally. The news passed through the room like background music. A headline about an election appeared. Someone looked up, read it, and then looked away. The election would happen later. For now, there was waiting to be done. The television continued speaking to no one in particular. In homes during the afternoon, the news reached fewer ears. People were at work. The radio played softly in empty rooms. The television spoke to itself. The news did not mind the quiet. When people returned home in the evening, the news returned with them. Televisions were turned on, radios were adjusted, newspapers were picked up again. The evening news had its own rhythm. Anchors spoke in measured tones. Stories followed one another without pause. There were no surprises in the format. Weather reports arrived on time, maps appeared, temperatures were listed, forecasts were given calmly. People listened more closely to the weather than to anything else. The weather mattered tomorrow. Stories about distant conflicts followed. The language was careful. The images were brief. The anchors did not linger. Viewers watched without reacting strongly. They trusted the distance. In living rooms, families sat together while the news played. Some paid attention, some did not. Some talked over it. Children played on the floor. Adults folded laundry. The news filled the room without interrupting. It was present but not central. In kitchens, the news played while dinner was prepared. Knives tapped lightly on cutting boards. Pots simmered. The radio described events while food cooked. Someone heard about a law being passed. Someone else heard about a speech being given. These facts entered the room and then left. Dinner was served. During meals, the television might remain on, or it might be turned off. If it stayed on, the volume was lowered. Conversations continued around it. No one paused eating to react strongly to a headline. In evenings, newspapers were read again, this time more slowly. People sat in chairs and turned pages methodically. They read about events that had already happened earlier in the day. The delay made them feel less urgent. The paper was folded neatly when finished. Later, the newspaper would be recycled or stacked with others. The news moved on. In bedrooms, radios played softly as people prepared for sleep. Late-night news programs spoke in even quieter tones. Voices slowed. Music played between segments. The news felt distant now, almost unreal. People drifted toward rest. Across America, millions of people heard the same news on the same day. They heard about the same events. They absorbed the same information. And yet, each person held it briefly, then let it go. The news was not meant to stay. It was meant to pass through. In offices the next day, yesterday's news was rarely mentioned. Something newer had already replaced it. The cycle continued. Radio voices changed, but the tone remained the same. Newspapers updated their pages. Television anchors changed suits. The structure did not change. The news maintained its calm delivery, its careful distance, its steady pace. It did not ask for strong emotions. It did not expect memory. It simply offered information and moved on. Some stories stayed longer than others. Some were remembered for years. Most were not. Most were read softly and soon forgotten. This forgetting was not failure. It was function. The news existed so that people could be aware without being overwhelmed. In this way, it fit perfectly into ordinary life. It filled quiet moments. It accompanied meals. It kept company during chores. It did not interrupt sleep. As night deepened, televisions were turned off. Radios went silent. Newspapers were set aside. The news rested. Tomorrow it would return with new words, new places, new events. It would speak in the same calm tone. It would be read softly, and most of it would be forgotten again. That was how it had always been. That was how it continued. And in that steady repetition, the news became part of the background of American life, present, familiar, and never quite loud enough to keep anyone awake.
Evenings that repeated themselves comfortably. Evening arrived without asking for attention. It did not interrupt the day or announce its presence. It simply slipped in, gently, as the light outside softened and the pace of everything slowed. In America, evenings were not dramatic. They were familiar. They were expected. They repeated themselves, and people found comfort in that repetition. The sun lowered gradually, changing the color of the sky without asking anyone to notice. Shadows lengthened across sidewalks and lawns. The heat of the day faded just enough to be felt, though few people stopped to think about it. Inside homes, clocks moved toward the same hour they always did. Dinner time approached. In kitchens, routines took over. Cabinets opened. Pots were placed on stoves. Ingredients were taken from refrigerators and set on counters. The movements were practiced, almost automatic. Meals were not experiments. They were known quantities. A pan warmed. Something sizzled lightly. A pot simmered without boiling over. The smell of familiar food filled the room. Not exciting, just reassuring. People did not rush. Evening did not demand speed. At tables, plates were set down one by one. Utensils were placed where they always went. Glasses were filled with water or something equally ordinary. Chairs were pulled back. People sat. Dinner conversations began softly, if they began at all. Some evenings were quiet. Some included small talk that did not need to be remembered. Someone mentioned their day at work. Someone else nodded. The details were not important. The meal progressed at an unhurried pace. Outside, streets grew quieter. Cars passed less frequently. The sound of traffic softened, blending into the distance. Neighbors returned home and stayed there. In apartments, the sound of other dinners drifted through walls, muffled voices, the clink of dishes, the hum of televisions being turned on. Each home followed its own rhythm, but the rhythms aligned. After dinner, dishes were cleared, plates were stacked, leftovers were covered and placed away for later. The kitchen was clean just enough, not perfectly, enough to feel finished. Lights were turned on in living rooms as daylight faded. Lamps cast warm circles on walls and floors. The light was softer than the sun, easier on the eyes. Televisions were turned on at familiar times. The programs were the same ones people had been watching for years. Sitcoms with recognizable characters, game shows with predictable formats, news programs that spoke calmly. People settled into couches and chairs that held their shape from repeated use. This settling was an important part of the evening. Remote controls were picked up and placed back down. Volume levels were adjusted slightly. Channels were changed briefly and then returned to. The choice of program did not feel like a decision. It felt like continuation. In some homes, radios played softly instead. Music filled the space gently, not demanding attention. In others, the television stayed off, and the quiet was enough. Evenings allowed for both. On quiet streets, porch lights turned on one by one. They marked the presence of people inside without revealing much else. Sidewalks emptied. Children were called inside. The day's movement faded. A person walked a dog slowly, the leash loose, the route familiar. The dog stopped at the same places it always stopped. Nothing had changed. Inside homes, people shifted positions. Someone stretched their legs, someone leaned back. The body recognized evening as a signal to rest. In bedrooms, clothes were laid out for the next day or placed back into drawers. Shoes were lined up near doors. Small preparations were made without thought. In bathrooms, routines repeated. Water ran, faces were washed, teeth were brushed. Mirrors reflected tired expressions that were neither good nor bad. The evening did not judge the day that had passed. In living rooms, familiar voices came from the television. The same actors spoke in the same settings. The same jokes landed with the same mild amusement. Laughter, when it came, was quiet. Commercial breaks interrupted the programs, but even those were expected. The commercials repeated too. Everything knew its place. In some homes, people read newspapers or books. Pages turned slowly. The words did not demand focus. Reading in the evening was less about information and more about habit. Outside, the sky darkened further. Stars appeared faintly in some places. In others, streetlights replaced them. The world narrowed to a few familiar rooms. Evenings were not for ambition. They were for slowing down. In small towns, businesses closed early. Signs were turned off. Doors were locked. The town rested. In cities, the pace slowed but did not stop. Still, even there, the evening felt different from the day. Offices emptied. Workspaces went quiet. The noise shifted. People returned home and joined the shared rhythm of evening. In some homes, dinner happened late, in others early, but eventually everyone reached the same point, the point where the day no longer asked for anything. Lights were dimmed, lamps replaced overhead fixtures. The atmosphere softened. In bedrooms, beds were turned down, sheets were smoothed, pillows were arranged. The bed waited patiently. People changed into clothes meant for rest. The fabric felt softer, the fit looser. The body responded without being told. Television stayed on longer in some homes. Late-night programs played quietly, voices lowered. In others, the television was turned off earlier, replaced by silence. Silence was welcome. Evenings were full of moments where nothing important happened. A glance at the clock, a sip of water, a quiet sigh. These moments did not need meaning. In families, people sat together without speaking. Their presence was enough. In single households, people enjoyed the quiet alone. Both felt complete. Outside, the streets were almost empty now. The sound of a distant car passed briefly, then faded. Night settled fully. Inside, lamps stayed on just long enough. Then one by one, they were turned off. Darkness filled rooms gently, without surprise. The evening did not end suddenly. It drifted. People moved toward bedrooms at different times, guided by tiredness rather than schedules. Doors closed softly.
The day was finished. It had not been remarkable. It had not needed to be. Evenings like this had happened before. They would happen again. That was what made them comforting. As sleep approached, the mind released the details of the day. Conversations faded, images blurred. The body rested into familiar patterns. Outside, the houses stood quietly. Lights were out. Streets were still. Inside, people slept. The evening had done its work. It had brought the day to a gentle close, just as it always did. And tomorrow, after rest, the cycle would begin again, slowly, quietly, and without surprise. That was the comfort of evenings that repeated themselves. That was enough.
Money handled carefully and without excitement. Money rarely arrived with excitement. In most American lives, it came quietly, on predictable days, in familiar amounts. It did not make announcements. It did not cause celebration. It simply appeared, did what it was meant to do, and then moved along. Payday was marked on calendars, but not circled with enthusiasm. It was expected, the way seasons were expected. It arrived, was acknowledged, and then passed. Checks were deposited. Accounts were updated. The numbers changed slightly. That was all. In offices, paychecks were handed out in envelopes or transferred electronically without ceremony. People glanced at the amount, nodded, and returned to what they had been doing. The money was not surprising. It was what had been agreed upon. Some people thought about how it would be used. Others did not think much at all. The routine was familiar enough to require little attention. In factories, pay was collected at the end of shifts or weeks. Envelopes were folded and placed into pockets. The weight of the envelope felt the same every time. It represented work completed. On kitchen tables, bills were stacked neatly. Envelopes waited to be opened. Some were opened immediately. Others were left until later in the evening. Electricity, water, rent, mortgage, insurance. The names were familiar. People sat down with pens and paper. They wrote checks slowly, carefully. Amounts were copied exactly. Dates were written clearly. Mistakes were avoided when possible. The process was quiet. In some homes, a small notebook recorded expenses. Numbers were written in columns. Totals were added at the bottom. The math was simple, but it mattered. People checked their calculations twice, not because they were worried, but because they wanted things to stay in order. Order brought comfort. In kitchens, jars held small savings. Coins accumulated slowly. Bills were folded and tucked inside. These jars were not meant to grow quickly. They were meant to be there when needed. Sometimes the jar was opened for something specific. Sometimes it was left untouched for months. The presence of the jar mattered more than the amount inside it. In living rooms, conversations about money happened quietly, if they happened at all. Voices were lowered. Details were kept private. Money was discussed in practical terms. What needed to be paid, what could wait. There was no excitement in these conversations. There was responsibility. In offices, accountants reviewed spreadsheets. Numbers were adjusted. Budgets were maintained. They worked carefully, without drama. The numbers told stories, but the stories were not emotional. They were procedural. In stores, cash registers opened and closed, receipts printed. Change was counted out carefully. Transactions were completed politely. No one rushed. Money moved from hand to hand and then moved on. In banks, tellers stood behind counters. Customers approached one at a time. Deposits were made. Withdrawals were completed. The process was smooth because it had been practiced. Forms were filled out. Identification was checked. Numbers were entered into systems. The bank was quiet. In homes, small worries about money came and went. They did not stay long enough to be named fears.
Someone wondered briefly if they should spend less on groceries next week. Someone else thought about an upcoming repair. These thoughts passed. Money worries did not usually shout. They whispered. In the evening, bills were sorted again. Some were paid, some were set aside for later. Envelopes were returned to drawers, pens were capped. The task was finished for the day. In retirement homes, pensions arrived on schedule. The amounts were known. The routine was settled. Money here was about stability, not growth. People lived within familiar boundaries. In households with children, allowances were given. Small amounts were counted out. Children learned that money came in limited quantities. This lesson was learned slowly, over time. In workplaces, conversations about raises were rare and brief. Expectations were modest. Money was not discussed as a source of joy. It was discussed as a necessity. That framing made it easier to manage. In grocery stores, people compared prices quietly. They chose familiar brands. They avoided unnecessary purchases. Carts moved slowly through aisles. Money shaped decisions gently, without force. In some homes, notebooks tracked long-term goals, a vacation, a repair, education. These goals were written down and revisited occasionally. They did not rush toward fulfillment. In cities, money moved faster, but the principles remained the same. Rent was paid, utilities were covered, the rest was managed carefully. In small towns, the pace was slower, but the care was just as steady. Across America, money flowed continuously. It moved through paychecks, bills, purchases, and savings. It did not stop. People did not expect it to. The steady flow of everyday economics supported routines that felt ordinary but required attention. This attention was quiet. In the background, larger economic forces moved. Interest rates changed, markets shifted, policies adjusted. Most people noticed these changes only faintly, if at all. Their focus remained on the immediate, the money in their hands. At night, wallets were placed on dressers, purses were set down, checks were filed away. Money rested. It would move again tomorrow. The careful handling of money was not glamorous. It did not inspire stories. But it allowed life to continue without interruption. It allowed rent to be paid, lights to stay on, food to be purchased. It allowed evenings to repeat themselves comfortably. In this way, money did its work quietly, without excitement, without drama. And that was exactly how it was meant to be.
Years passing without anyone noticing. Time did not announce itself. It did not knock on doors or interrupt conversations. It did not pause the day to explain what it was doing. Time simply moved quietly, steadily, passing through rooms and streets and lives without asking to be seen. Years passed this way. Most people did not notice when one year ended and another began. The calendar changed, but daily routines stayed the same. Mornings still arrived, evenings still repeated themselves. Life continued at a pace that felt familiar. Birthdays came and went. They were marked with small gestures, a cake from the grocery store, a card signed quickly, a short phone call, sometimes a quiet dinner. The number written on the card increased slowly, 1 year at a time. People noticed the number, but they did not dwell on it. The day after a birthday looked much like the day before. Seasons changed gently. Winter faded into spring without ceremony. Snow melted, grass returned, trees filled in again. Spring became summer. Windows opened, fans turned on. The air felt different but not unfamiliar. Summer passed into fall. Leaves changed color. They fell. The air cooled. Then winter returned. This cycle repeated itself so often that it felt permanent.
People adjusted their clothing and routines without thinking about it. Coats came out, then they were put away. The passage of time was measured in small changes. In homes, furniture stayed in the same places. Tables gathered marks slowly. Chairs softened with use. Walls held the same pictures year after year. Nothing needed to change. Children grew gradually. Their height was measured against door frames. Pencil marks appeared on the wall. Adults noticed occasionally, but the growth felt slow. Then one day, the marks were higher than expected. School years passed one after another. Notebooks filled and were replaced. Classrooms changed, but the routine remained. Homework was done. Lunches were packed. Buses arrived and left. Graduations came quietly. Caps were worn. Diplomas were handed out. Life moved forward without rushing. Work routines continued. People stayed in the same jobs for years. Desks remained familiar. Offices changed only slightly. Promotions happened sometimes. Titles changed. Responsibilities increased modestly. Most days were the same. Lunch breaks happened at the same hour. Coffee was brewed the same way. Conversations repeated themselves. People learned to recognize the rhythm of time rather than its milestones. Holidays returned each year with small variations. Decorations were brought out and put away. Meals followed familiar patterns. Thanksgiving dinners looked much like the ones before. Christmas lights were placed in the same spots. The repetition was comforting. Years accumulated quietly in photo albums. Images faded slightly. Styles changed gradually. Looking back, people noticed differences. Living forward, they did not. In neighborhoods, houses stayed standing. Lawns were mowed. Fences were repaired. Neighbors aged together without much discussion. Someone moved away. Someone else moved in. The street remained. In cities, buildings were renovated. Signs changed. Stores closed and reopened under new names. The street kept its shape. Time passed through these places without leaving obvious marks. Technology changed slowly, then faster. Radios gave way to televisions. Televisions became flatter. Phones changed shape. People adapted without much thought. They learned new routines to replace old ones. Workdays still ended in the evening. At home, calendars filled with appointments. Most were routine: dentist visits, school events, work meetings. Pages were turned. Years were crossed off. People rarely stopped to think about how many had passed. In families, roles shifted quietly. Children became adults. Parents grew older. The changes were noticed in small ways: slower movements, shorter patience. Still, the routines held. Meals were shared. Conversations continued. Time did not take these moments away suddenly. It eased them forward. Retirements arrived after decades of work. Farewell cards were signed. Cake was shared in break rooms. People cleaned out desks. The next week looked different, but life continued. Days became less structured. Mornings slowed. The passing of years felt softer here. Birthdays became quieter. Celebrations smaller. People preferred calm over noise. Seasons continued their cycle. In towns, events were repeated annually. Parades followed the same routes. Festivals returned to the same parks. People attended out of habit. They liked knowing what to expect. In living rooms, clocks ticked steadily. Their sound blended into the background. The ticking marked time, but it did not demand attention. People fell asleep to it. Years passed while people slept. They passed during ordinary afternoons, while dishes were washed, while newspapers were read. They passed through commutes and conversations. Time was present everywhere, but it rarely made itself known. Occasionally, someone noticed. A mirror reflected an older face. A familiar song felt distant. These moments were brief. Life continued. Documents accumulated in drawers. Warranties expired. Manuals became outdated. People adjusted. The slow drift of decades was not felt day by day. It was felt only in hindsight. Looking back, people saw how much had changed. Living forward, they noticed very little. Time was patient. It allowed routines to continue. It allowed comfort to remain. It allowed life to unfold gently. In this way, years passed without anyone noticing, and that quiet passing was what made life feel steady. The decades drifted on, and tomorrow arrived, just like the one before.
Falling asleep inside ordinary history. Nothing special needed to happen anymore. The day had done what it always did. It had arrived, unfolded, and gently stepped aside. There were no loose ends asking for attention, no unfinished urgency. Everything that needed to be done had already been done, or quietly postponed to another ordinary day. The world did not expect anything more. Outside, American life continued in its familiar, steady way. Streets rested under streetlights that had turned on without ceremony. Houses stood in neat rows or quiet clusters, holding inside them the slow breathing of people already asleep. Nothing dramatic marked the moment. History did not pause. It never did. It moved quietly now, like it always had, through bedrooms, through neighborhoods, through the long night. Inside a small house, a lamp was still on. Its light was soft and low, barely touching the walls. The room felt settled, as if it had been waiting for this moment. A chair held a jacket that had been worn earlier and would be worn again tomorrow. Shoes rested near the door, placed there without thought. The clock ticked steadily. This sound had been there for years. In another room, a radio played faintly, the volume turned down so low that words blended into tone. The voice speaking was calm, measured, familiar. It did not hurry. The voice carried the same cadence it always had, guiding listeners through the end of the day without effort. Somewhere, a train moved through the distance. Its sound was soft and far away, not close enough to interrupt sleep. It passed just as it always did. In kitchens, dishes had been left to dry. Counters were clean enough. Nothing waited urgently. Refrigerators hummed quietly, preserving tomorrow's meals without being noticed. In bedrooms, beds accepted tired bodies without resistance. Sheets folded around familiar shapes. Pillows supported heads that no longer held the weight of the day. Breathing slowed naturally. No one needed instructions. Across the country, millions of people were doing the same thing at the same time, settling into rest, guided by habits learned over years. They did not think of it as history, but it was. This was history continuing in its most ordinary form. Years earlier, similar nights had unfolded the same way. Lamps had been turned off, radios had played softly, clocks had ticked. People had fallen asleep without knowing they were part of something larger. They still did. History did not only happen in loud moments. It happened here, in quiet bedrooms, in calm neighborhoods, in evenings that faded gently into night. It happened when nothing else was happening. Outside, seasons continued their slow movement. Even now, the earth turned unnoticed. Weather shifted gradually. Tomorrow's temperature was already being decided somewhere far above. But tonight was settled. In apartments, hallways were quiet. Elevators stood still. Doors were closed. In rural homes, the darkness outside was deeper.
Stars were visible, though few people were awake to notice them. Inside, the world was smaller. The mind began to drift, releasing thoughts without effort. Lists loosened, memories softened. The details of the day lost their edges. Workplaces sat empty now. Desks waited, machines rested, files stayed closed. Nothing needed attention until morning. In offices and factories and schools, history paused in its quiet way, not stopping, just resting. The long story of ordinary American life continued without sound. Decades earlier, people had fallen asleep in the same way. Different beds, different rooms, the same gentle surrender to rest. Their days had been ordinary too. They had paid bills, prepared meals, gone to work, returned home. They had lived inside history without realizing it. Tonight was no different. The slow persistence of routines carried everyone forward without effort. The future was already forming, quietly, out of these calm moments. Nothing needed to be remembered right now. The clock continued ticking, steady and patient. The sound blended into the room, becoming part of the quiet rather than breaking it. Breathing deepened. Thoughts drifted further apart. The edges of awareness softened. Outside, the country rested as one large, quiet place, stitched together by roads, power lines, routines, and shared sleep. Even those still awake moved slowly now. Late-night workers, night shift drivers, hospital staff. They moved gently, keeping the world running while others rested. This too was ordinary. This too was history. But it did not ask to be noticed. As sleep settled in, the mind let go of time itself. Minutes passed without being counted. Hours drifted by unnoticed. Morning would arrive eventually, just like it always did. But for now, it was enough to rest inside the calm persistence of American life. The quiet homes, the steady clocks, the familiar rhythms that had carried generations forward. Nothing urgent waited. Nothing demanded attention. History continued softly while you slept. And that was the most ordinary, comforting thing of all.